High in the Appalachian wilderness, an abandoned cabin sat rotting beneath decades of neglect, forgotten by everyone except the desperate young man who stumbled upon it with nothing but the clothes on his back. 17-year-old Cole Brennan had lost everything: his family, his home, his future. But in those crumbling walls and collapsed timbers, he saw something no one else could see. Armed with salvaged tools and a determination forged by loss, Cole began to rebuild. Log by log, stone by stone, he transformed the ruins into something extraordinary, a creation so remarkable that when the townspeople finally discovered what he had done, they stood in stunned silence. What drove a homeless boy to pour his soul into an abandoned structure? What secret did those mountains hold that only Cole could unlock? And why would powerful men stop at nothing to take it all away? The road stretched endlessly before him, a ribbon of cracked asphalt winding through the Appalachian wilderness, like a scar on the mountain's face. Cole Brennan walked with his head down, his worn sneakers scuffing against the pavement with each weary step, the rhythm of his footfalls the only sound in the vast silence of the forest. He was 17 years old, though the weight on his shoulders made him feel ancient, and everything he owned in this world was stuffed into the faded blue backpack that hung from his thin frame. Inside were the remnants of a life that had crumbled to dust in a matter of weeks. A change of clothes, a pocket knife his mother had given him on his 15th birthday, a water bottle filled from a gas station restroom 3 towns back, and a photograph of his mother taken on a summer day when her smile still came easily and her eyes still held light. That light had faded slowly over 2 years of illness, dimming a little more with each round of treatments they couldn't afford, each bill that piled up on the kitchen table like autumn leaves. Each night, Cole heard her crying softly in her bedroom when she thought he was asleep. She had fought so hard, worked double shifts at the diner, even when she could barely stand, all to keep a roof over their heads and food on the table and hope alive in her son's heart. But the cancer didn't care about hope or hard work or love, and on a cold Tuesday morning in March, she had closed her eyes for the last time, leaving Cole alone in a world that had never shown him much kindness. The bank had wasted no time. The foreclosure notice arriving before her body was even in the ground, and the social workers had come with their clipboards and their sympathetic smiles, talking about foster placement and group homes and opportunities for a fresh start. Cole had nodded and agreed and signed whatever they put in front of him. And then on the night before they were supposed to take him to his new placement, he had climbed out his bedroom window with his backpack and disappeared into the darkness. That was 11 days ago, and he had been walking ever since, hitching rides when he could, sleeping in barns and under bridges, moving always toward the mountains, because the mountains didn't ask questions and didn't try to put you in a system and didn't look at you with pity in their eyes. He had no plan beyond the next mile, no destination beyond a way, no future beyond surviving until tomorrow. The sky above him was darkening, not with the gentle fade of evening, but with the angry purple bruise of an approaching storm, and the wind was picking up, carrying the smell of rain and the taste of electricity. Cole quickened his pace, his eyes scanning the tree line for any sign of shelter, an overhang, a cave, even a thick stand of pines that might break the coming deluge. His stomach cramped with hunger, and his legs ached with exhaustion, but he pushed forward, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering, and remembering meant feeling the grief that he kept locked in a box deep inside his chest, where it couldn't destroy him. A rumble of thunder rolled across the mountains, deep and ominous, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall, splattering against his face like cold tears. He broke into a jog, his backpack bouncing against his spine, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the rain intensified, soaking through his thin jacket and plastering his dark hair to his forehead. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the forest in a flash of white, and in that brief moment of brilliance, Cole saw something that made him stumble to a halt. A narrow trail cutting into the woods, overgrown but unmistakable, leading away from the road and up into the mountain. He didn't know where it went or what he would find at its end, but he knew he couldn't stay on this road, not with the storm breaking overhead and the darkness closing in and his body screaming for rest. He turned off the asphalt and plunged into the forest, the trees closing around him like a curtain. And as the rain poured down, and the thunder crashed, and the world dissolved into chaos, Cole Brennan walked toward whatever fate the mountain had in store for him, alone and afraid, but still moving, still fighting, still alive. The trail was barely visible beneath the overgrowth, a whisper of a path that nature had spent years trying to reclaim. But Cole pushed forward through the grasping branches and tangled undergrowth, the rain hammering down on him with relentless fury as lightning turned the forest into a strobe of white and shadow. His feet slipped on the muddy ground, and thorns tore at his jeans and raked across his hands. But he kept climbing, kept moving, because there was nowhere else to go, and nothing to do but follow this forgotten trail to wherever it led. The forest grew denser, the canopy overhead so thick that even the rain seemed muted. And then, without warning, the trees parted, and Cole stumbled into a small clearing. And there it was, rising from the undergrowth, like a ghost from another time. A cabin. He stood at the edge of the clearing, rain streaming down his face, and stared at the structure before him with a mixture of wonder and despair. The cabin was a ruin. There was no denying that, with half its roof collapsed inward, the wooden shingles rotted and scattered like broken teeth, and the walls sagging at angles that defied gravity, their logs dark with moisture and age, and covered in thick blankets of moss and lichen. The windows were empty sockets, the glass long since shattered, and the front door hung crookedly from a single rusted hinge, swaying gently in the wind like a beckoning hand. Vines had crawled up the walls and through the cracks, and small trees had sprouted in the debris, their roots working slowly to pull the structure back into the earth from which it came. It was a skeleton of a home, a corpse of someone's dream, and under normal circumstances Cole would have kept walking, would have looked for something better, something safer. But normal circumstances had ended the moment his mother stopped breathing, and right now, this ruin was the only shelter for miles, and the storm was not letting up, and his body was shaking so hard from cold and exhaustion that he could barely stand. He crossed the clearing on unsteady legs and pushed through the crooked door, stepping into a darkness that smelled of mold and animal musk and decades of neglect. He pulled out his phone, its battery nearly dead, and used its feeble light to survey his surroundings. The cabin was a single large room, and the half of it beneath the collapsed roof was a disaster of rotted wood and pooling water, but the other half, protected by beams that had somehow held through years of snow and wind, was relatively dry. Against one wall stood a rusted wood stove, its pipe bent and disconnected, and beside it lay the remains of a chair, its seat broken through, but its frame still intact. On the far wall, barely visible beneath the grime and water damage, hung 3 photographs in frames that had once been elegant, but were now warped and discolored. Cole moved closer, wiping the glass with his sleeve, and saw faces staring back at him across the years. A man with a thick beard and kind eyes, a woman in a simple dress with flowers in her hair, and a shot of the cabin itself, newly built, its logs golden and its windows gleaming in the sunlight, a proud testament to someone's labor and love. Who were these people, Cole wondered, and what had happened to them? And how had this place that someone had built with such care come to be forgotten by the world? He had no answers, and the questions only added to the ache in his chest. But he didn't have time for mysteries or melancholy, not with the night closing in and his body demanding rest. He found a corner of the cabin that was dry and relatively clean, beneath the section of roof that still held, and he cleared away the debris with his bare hands, pushing aside chunks of wood and animal droppings, and the undesiccated corpses of insects, creating a space just large enough for his body. He pulled his one change of clothes from his backpack, using the dry shirt as a pillow, and he lay down on the hard wooden floor, curling into himself for warmth as the storm raged outside, and the cabin creaked and groaned around him like a living thing. The rain drummed on what remained of the roof, and the wind howled through the broken windows, and somewhere in the forest an owl called out, its voice lonely and ancient. Cole should have felt afraid, should have felt despair at how far he had fallen. A homeless orphan sleeping in a ruin in the middle of nowhere, with nothing to his name, and no one in the world who cared whether he lived or died. But as he lay there in the darkness, listening to the storm, and feeling the solidity of the floor beneath him and the walls around him, something unexpected happened. He felt a connection, a sense of belonging that he hadn't felt since before his mother got sick. This cabin, for all its decay, had been someone's home, had been built by hands that knew the value of shelter and the meaning of sanctuary. And even in its ruined state, it was offering him protection, was keeping him dry and alive when the world outside wanted to wash him away. He didn't know if he believed in signs or fate, or any of that, but lying there in the darkness of this forgotten place, Cole Brennan felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. He felt like maybe, just maybe, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind a world washed clean and gleaming under a morning sun that streamed through the gaps in the ruined roof, like fingers of gold. Cole woke slowly, his body stiff and aching from the hard floor, and for a moment he didn't know where he was, his mind still foggy with sleep. And then the memories came flooding back. The road, the rain, the trail, the cabin. He walked to the doorway and stepped out onto what had once been a porch, but was now just a few rotted planks clinging to the foundation. The clearing looked different in the daylight, less ominous, and more simply sad, a forgotten place slowly being swallowed by the forest. But as Cole stood there in the cool morning air, really looking at the cabin for the first time without rain in his eyes and desperation in his heart, he began to see something beyond the decay. He saw the bones of the structure, the skeleton beneath the rot, and those bones were strong. He stepped off the porch and began to walk the perimeter, studying the cabin with an intensity he didn't fully understand. The logs that made up the walls were thick and solid, old-growth timber, and while the upper courses had suffered from exposure and moisture, the lower sections were still sound, still locked together in tight, precise joints that had held for decades. The stone foundation was even more impressive. Massive flat rocks fitted together without mortar, and not a single stone had shifted or cracked despite years of frost and settling. Cole ran his hand along the logs, feeling the texture of the wood, and something stirred in him, a familiarity that felt almost like memory. His father had been a carpenter before the drinking got bad, and he walked out on Cole and his mother when Cole was 9 years old. Cole had hated him for that, but he couldn't forget everything. He remembered sitting in his father's workshop as a small boy, watching him shape wood with his hands, listening to him talk about the nature of timber and the importance of joinery. Those memories were painful, tangled up with abandonment and betrayal, but they were also knowledge. And as he walked around the ruined cabin, he felt those fragments beginning to stir and connect. Beyond the cabin, half hidden by brambles, he noticed another structure, smaller, almost completely collapsed. He pushed through the undergrowth and found the remains of a shed, and inside, beneath a pile of rotted wood and dead leaves, he found a toolbox. It was old and rusted, but inside, wrapped in an oilcloth, were tools: a hammer with a hickory handle, a handsaw with a still-sharp blade, chisels and files, and a measuring tape, and a level. Cole lifted the hammer, feeling its weight in his hand, the way it seemed to fit his grip like it had been waiting for him. Standing in that clearing with these tools in his hands, something shifted inside him. He would not just shelter here for a night or a week. He would rebuild this cabin, would learn what he needed to learn, and he would make this forgotten place his home. It was crazy. A 17-year-old homeless kid, with no money and no skills, thinking he could restore a ruined cabin in the wilderness. But crazy was all he had left, and as Cole carried the toolbox back to the cabin, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, something that burned in his chest like an ember waiting for breath. He felt hope. The work began the next morning, before the sun had fully crested the eastern ridge, and it did not stop until darkness made it impossible to see. Cole started with the debris, the mountain of rotted wood and broken shingles, and accumulated filth that filled the collapsed half of the cabin, carrying it out armload by armload, and piling it in the clearing, where he would later burn it. The labor was backbreaking and monotonous, and by midday his arms were shaking, and his back was screaming, and his hands, soft from years of school and indoor life, were raw and blistering against the rough wood. He didn't stop. He couldn't stop, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling. And the grief inside him was a black hole that would swallow him whole if he gave it the chance. So he worked, hour after hour, day after day, letting the physical pain drown out the pain in his heart, letting the exhaustion quiet the voices in his head that told him he was foolish, that he was alone, that he would fail. The cabin fought him, at every turn, revealing new problems each time he solved an old one, a cascade of decay that seemed endless and insurmountable. He removed the rotted roof beams and discovered that water had seeped into the wall logs beneath them, softening them to pulp. He tore out the damaged logs and found that the joints connecting them to the solid sections were complex, interlocking cuts that he didn't know how to replicate. He made mistakes constantly, cutting boards too short, fitting joints too loose, learning through failure what his father had tried to teach him through instruction all those years ago. He remembered his father's hands, calloused and sure, guiding the saw through the wood with a confidence that seemed almost magical to a young boy. He remembered the lessons, fragments of them, about measuring twice and cutting once, about working with the grain instead of against it, about respecting the wood and letting it tell you what it wanted to be. Those memories were bitter, poisoned by the abandonment that followed them. But they were also useful, and Cole clung to them like a drowning man clings to driftwood, using them to stay afloat in a sea of ignorance. He scavenged materials from the forest, spending hours searching for fallen logs that were straight and sound, dragging them back to the cabin with ropes he fashioned from vines, his shoulders burning and his feet slipping in the mud. He collected flat stones from the creek bed for patching the foundation, wading into the icy water and hauling them out one by one until his legs were numb and his fingers were blue. He dug clay from a bank he found upstream, mixing it with water and straw to make a crude mortar that he packed into the gaps between the logs, filling the cracks that let in wind and rain and cold. The days blurred together, each one a repetition of the one before, a cycle of waking and working and collapsing into sleep, so deep it was almost like death. His body transformed under the demands he placed on it, the softness melting away, replaced by lean, hard muscle that he didn't recognize when he caught his reflection in the creek. His hands grew calluses over the blisters, thick pads of toughened skin that no longer tore when he gripped the hammer or the saw. And slowly, so slowly that he almost didn't notice it happening, the cabin began to change. A beam secured, a hole patched, a section of wall made solid and true. They were small victories, insignificant in the face of all that remained to be done. But each one sent a surge of something through Cole's chest, a warmth that pushed back against the cold grief, a light that flickered in the darkness. He was building something, creating something with his own hands, and with each board he nailed and each stone he set, he was proving to himself that he was more than his loss, more than his pain, more than a homeless orphan with nothing and no one. He was becoming someone who could shape the world instead of just being battered by it, and that knowledge, fragile as it was enough to keep him going. The decision to go into town was not one Cole made lightly, and he put it off for as long as he possibly could, stretching his meager supplies to the breaking point, rationing the last of his food until his stomach was a constant knot of hunger, and his hands trembled when he tried to grip his tools. But there were things he needed that the forest could not provide, and so on a cool morning, with mist still clinging to the hollows, he tucked his remaining money into his pocket, a pitiful collection of crumpled bills and loose change that amounted to less than $20, and began the long walk down the mountain toward the town called Ridgewood. The walk took nearly 3 hours, and with each step closer to civilization, Cole felt his anxiety growing, a tightness in his chest that made it hard to breathe. He had been alone in the woods for weeks now, and the thought of being around people again, of being seen and judged and questioned, filled him with a dread that bordered on panic. He knew what he looked like, a dirty, ragged teenager, with hollow cheeks and wild eyes, clothes that were more stained than fabric, hands that were cracked and filthy. He looked like what he was, a homeless kid, a runaway, a problem, and people did not respond kindly to problems. Ridgewood announced itself with a faded sign peppered with buckshot holes, and beyond it lay a main street frozen in time, a collection of brick and wooden buildings with hand-painted signs and pickup trucks parked along the curb. Cole walked down the sidewalk with his head up, fighting the urge to hunch his shoulders and make himself small, and he felt the eyes on him immediately, gazes from windows and doorways, from the old men on benches outside the barber shop. They didn't say anything, but their silence was its own message, a wall of suspicion that pressed against him from all sides. He found the hardware store at the end of the street, a cramped building that smelled of metal and oil and sawdust. He moved through the aisles with painful deliberation, calculating what he could afford. Nails were essential, and he selected a small box of the cheapest ones, a file to sharpen his tools. With the few dollars that remained, he chose a bag of rice because it was the most calories for the least money. He brought his items to the counter where the owner stood waiting, a gruff-looking man in his 60s with thick forearms. A small sign read, "Harold Tatum, Proprietor," and Harold Tatum studied Cole with narrow eyes that missed nothing. Cole counted out his money carefully, painfully aware of how pathetic the pile must look, and he pushed it across the counter without meeting the man's gaze. Harold rang up the items slowly and announced the total, and Cole felt relief when he realized he had just enough. Harold bagged the items and pushed them across the counter, and for a moment their eyes met, something unreadable in the older man's gaze. But Harold said nothing, and Cole took the bag and walked out as quickly as he could without running. The eyes followed him all the way down the main street, and he could hear the whispers starting behind him. He didn't stop until the town was out of sight. He had gotten what he needed, but the experience left him shaken and more determined than ever to make the cabin work, to build a life in the woods where he didn't need anyone, and no one needed to know he existed. The trip to town left Cole shaken, but more determined than ever, and he threw himself into the work with a ferocity that bordered on obsession, rising before dawn and laboring until his body simply refused to continue, then collapsing into a sleep so deep that even dreams couldn't reach him. The roof was his primary focus now, because without a solid roof, nothing else mattered, and he attacked it with a methodical intensity that surprised even himself. He felled small trees with the hand saw, trimming them into beams that he dragged back to the cabin one by one, his shoulders raw from the rope and his legs burning from the effort. He built a makeshift ramp from scrap lumber, a rickety contraption that groaned under the weight of each log, but held together long enough for him to wrestle the beams up onto the remaining structure, positioning them across the gap where the old roof had collapsed. The first attempts were disasters, the beams too short or too long, or seated at angles that wouldn't hold weight, and more than once he had to tear out hours of work and start again from nothing. But with each failure came understanding, and with understanding came skill, and slowly, painfully, he began to get it right. He learned to measure with his eye, to feel when a joint was tight and true, to read the wood and work with its grain instead of against it. The beams began to fit together like they belonged there, and when he laid the first course of salvaged shingles across them and saw that they were level and solid, something swelled in his chest that he hadn't felt in so long he almost didn't recognize it. Pride. While exploring the woods for materials, Cole discovered a natural spring bubbling up from a mossy hillside about 200 yards from the cabin, and he spent 3 days digging a channel to direct the water closer, lining it with flat stones to keep it from silting up. The work was brutal, his hands and knees caked with mud, his back screaming from the constant stooping. But when he finished and watched the clear, cold water flowing down his little canal and pooling in a basin he had dug beside the cabin, he felt like he had accomplished something miraculous. He had water now, clean and reliable, and that meant he could stay here, could really live here, could stop merely surviving, and start actually building a life. Weeks passed, each one bleeding into the next, and the cabin transformed around him. The roof took shape, the walls grew solid and tight, the gaps filled with clay and moss until the wind no longer whistled through. He built a new door from planks he split himself, hanging it on hinges he had salvaged and cleaned and oiled until they swung smooth and true. He wasn't just patching anymore, wasn't just fighting against decay. He was creating something, shaping the world with his own hands, and when he stood in the clearing at the end of each day and looked at what he had built, he saw not just a cabin, but a reflection of himself, proof that he was capable of more than he had ever imagined. The rice ran out on a Tuesday, and by Thursday Cole was so hungry that his vision swam when he stood up too quickly, and his hands shook so badly he could barely grip his tools. He had been surviving on what he could forage from the forest, dandelion greens and wild onions, and the occasional handful of berries. But it wasn't enough. Not nearly enough to fuel the brutal labor he demanded of his body each day. He needed food, real food, and so he ranged farther from the cabin than he had ever gone before, following the creek downstream in search of anything edible, and that was how he found himself standing at the edge of a small farm, staring at rows of vegetables that made his stomach clench with desperate longing. He didn't mean to trespass, didn't mean to steal, but the hunger was a roar in his ears that drowned out reason, and he was halfway across the field with a handful of green beans clutched to his chest when the voice stopped him cold. It was a woman's voice, sharp and clear, and it came from the porch of the small farmhouse at the edge of the property, and it said simply, "You planning to pay for those, or should I get my shotgun?" Cole froze, his heart hammering, every instinct screaming at him to run, but his legs wouldn't obey, and he stood there in the middle of the field, like a deer in headlights, as the woman came down from the porch and walked toward him. She was old, perhaps 70, with white hair pulled back in a practical bun, and a face that was weathered and lined but still handsome, with sharp blue eyes that seemed to see right through him. She wore work clothes, sturdy pants, and a flannel shirt, and she moved with the easy confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime on this land and feared nothing it could throw at her. She stopped a few feet away and looked at him, really looked, taking in the dirt and the hunger and the desperation, and something in her expression shifted, the hardness giving way to something that might have been recognition or might have been pity. "You're the one living up at the old Crenshaw place," she said, and it wasn't a question. Cole nodded, unable to speak, still clutching the beans like they were a lifeline. The woman studied him for a long moment, then shook her head and turned back toward the house. "Well, come on then," she called over her shoulder. "If you're going to eat my food, you might as well eat it cooked." Her name was Martha Albright, and she had lived in these mountains for all of her 73 years, had buried a husband and raised 3 children, and weathered more hardship than Cole could imagine. And she sat him down at her kitchen table and put a plate of hot food in front of him, and watched him eat with an expression that was equal parts kindness and appraisal. She asked questions, gentle but probing, and Cole answered with a version of the truth that left out the worst parts, the foster care and the running away, but included enough to explain how he had ended up alone in a ruined cabin with nothing but determination and desperation. Martha listened without interrupting, and when he was finished, she nodded slowly and made him an offer that changed everything. Honest work on her farm in exchange for food and whatever supplies she could spare. It was the first kindness anyone had shown him since his mother died, and Cole accepted it with a gratitude so profound he couldn't find the words to express it. Cole began working at Martha's farm 3 days a week, walking the miles down the mountain in the early morning darkness, and returning in the evening with food in his belly and supplies in his pack, and it was during these visits that he learned the truth about the place he had chosen to call home. Martha told him the story in pieces, a little at a time, and Cole listened with an intensity that surprised them both. His name was Silas Crenshaw, Martha explained, and he had come to these mountains nearly 50 years ago, a young man with extraordinary talent and a desire for solitude that bordered on the pathological. He built the cabin with his own hands, every log and stone and joint, and then he built a workshop behind it, and in that workshop he created furniture that became legendary throughout the region. People said Silas Crenshaw could make wood sing, that his chairs and tables and cabinets were so beautiful they seemed less like furniture and more like living things, and wealthy collectors from as far away as New York and Chicago would journey to his remote cabin just to commission a piece. But Silas was difficult, Martha said, a man who kept his own counsel and trusted no one, who could go months without speaking to another human being, who turned away more customers than he accepted. He never married, never had children, and the people of Ridgewood regarded him with a mixture of awe and unease. And then, just over 20 years ago, Silas Crenshaw vanished. Martha paused when she reached this part, her eyes distant with memory. One autumn he was there, and the next spring he simply wasn't, and no one knew what had happened. His truck was still parked beside the cabin, his tools still in his workshop, but Silas himself was gone without a trace. The sheriff investigated, but there was no evidence of foul play, nothing to suggest anything other than that he had walked into the woods one day and never come back. Some thought he had gotten lost and died. Others whispered darker theories, and still others claimed the mountain had taken him. Whatever the truth, the cabin had sat empty ever since, and the people of Ridgewood had learned to avoid it, to warn their children away from the cursed place. Martha fixed Cole with a steady gaze as she finished. She told him she didn't believe in curses, thought it was nonsense, but she warned him that not everyone felt the same. Some people had long memories, and they didn't like outsiders disturbing things left alone for 20 years. Cole should be careful, she cautioned, should keep his head down, because there were folks who would see his presence as a provocation. Cole listened to every word and thanked her for telling him the truth. But as he walked back up the mountain that evening, his mind heavy with history, he knew that nothing she had said would change his course. The cabin was his now, whatever its past, and he would rebuild it and make it his home, and no amount of superstition or suspicion would drive him away. The cabin was becoming habitable now, solid and weathertight, and Cole found himself with something he hadn't had since arriving on the mountain. Time. Time to think, to plan, to imagine what this place could become beyond mere shelter. And as he sat in the clearing one evening, watching the sun sink behind the ridgeline, he felt a stirring inside him that he didn't immediately recognize. It was creativity, a desire to make something, not just functional, but beautiful. And once he acknowledged it, once he let himself feel it, it grew into a hunger as powerful as any he had known. He started with shelving, simple planks mounted on the wall to hold his few possessions. But even in that basic project, he found himself making choices that went beyond necessity, selecting boards with interesting grain patterns, cutting angles that pleased his eye, sanding the surfaces smooth, even though no one would ever see them but him. The shelving led to a table, and the table led to chairs, and with each piece he attempted, he pushed himself further, tried techniques he had never attempted, failed and tried again, and failed better until finally he produced something that made him step back and stare. The pieces were rough, he could see that, full of imperfections that a trained eye would catch immediately. But they were also undeniably his, born from his hands and his mind, and they possessed a vitality that surprised him. He had never thought of himself as creative, had never imagined that he had any talent for making things, but here was evidence to the contrary, and it awakened something in him that had been sleeping his entire life. It was while searching for a particular type of wood, a piece with a curve that matched the image in his mind, that Cole rediscovered the workshop. He had noticed the collapsed shed behind the cabin early on, had salvaged the toolbox from its ruins, but he had never explored it fully, too focused on the immediate demands of the cabin itself. Now, with more time and more curiosity, he pushed through the overgrowth and began to clear away the debris. And what he found beneath it made his breath catch in his throat. The shed had collapsed, yes, but only partially. And beneath the fallen roof was a space that had been protected from the worst of the elements, a space filled with treasures that made Cole feel like he had stumbled into a pharaoh's tomb. There were tools everywhere, specialized instruments whose purposes he could only guess at, chisels and gouges and planes in sizes and shapes he had never seen, all of them rusted but all of them salvageable, all of them waiting for hands to bring them back to life. There were pieces of wood stored in racks, exotic species with colors and grains that seemed almost unnatural, seasoned and ready for use even after 2 decades. And there, on a workbench that had somehow survived the collapse intact, was a leather-bound journal, its pages swollen with moisture, but still legible, still intact. Cole opened it with trembling hands, and what he found inside changed everything. It was Silas Crenshaw's journal, a record of his techniques and his philosophy, filled with sketches and diagrams and dense paragraphs of handwritten text that detailed everything from how to select timber to how to cut joints to how to apply finishes that would last for generations. But it was more than just a technical manual. It was a window into the mind of a master, a man who saw woodworking not as a trade, but as a calling, who believed that every piece of furniture was a collaboration between the craftsman and the wood, that the job of the maker was not to impose his will, but to discover what the material wanted to become, and help it get there. Cole read late into the night by the light of a candle, and when he finally closed the journal, he knew that he held in his hands not just a book, but a Bible, a guide that would teach him everything Silas Crenshaw knew, if only he had the patience and the dedication to learn. News travels slowly in small mountain towns, but it travels surely, passing from mouth to mouth like a virus until everyone has been touched by it. And by the time Cole had been at the cabin for 2 months, everyone in Ridgewood knew about the boy living up at the old Crenshaw place. They talked about him at the diner over coffee, speculated about him at the feed store while loading bags of grain, whispered about him after church while their children played in the parking lot. Most of the talk was dismissive, even scornful, the comfortable mockery of people who knew better, directed at someone who clearly didn't. He was a runaway, they said, a homeless kid playing house in a ruin that would collapse on his head before the first real snow. He was a fool who didn't understand what he had gotten himself into, who would come crawling back to civilization as soon as the nights turned cold, and the reality of mountain life set in. Give him a month, they said, 2 at most, and he would be gone, and the Crenshaw cabin would go back to rotting in peace the way it was supposed to. But not everyone dismissed the boy so easily, and among those who paid closer attention was a man named Victor Hale. Victor was not from Ridgewood originally, had grown up in Charleston, and made his fortune in real estate development before turning his attention to the mountains of his home state, and he was not accustomed to complications in his plans. He was in his late 50s, trim and silver-haired, with the easy smile and firm handshake of a man who had learned long ago that charm was just another tool for getting what you wanted. He had been buying up land in the mountain region for nearly 5 years now, quietly and patiently, assembling parcels for a resort development that would transform the area and make him richer than he already was. The project was massive, a sprawling complex of hotels and vacation homes and golf courses and ski slopes that would bring thousands of tourists to a region that had never seen anything like it. And Victor had invested millions of dollars and countless hours of political maneuvering to make it happen. The Crenshaw property was a small piece of the puzzle, only 160 acres, but it sat in a critical location, straddling the access road that would connect the main resort to the ski facilities on the upper mountain. Victor needed that land, and he had assumed he would get it without much trouble. The cabin had been abandoned for over 20 years, the taxes unpaid, and it was only a matter of time before the county seized it and put it up for auction, where Victor's representatives would acquire it quietly and anonymously, just as they had acquired a dozen other parcels. It was supposed to be simple, a minor line item in a vast and complex project, and Victor had barely given it a second thought. But now there was a boy living there, a boy who was not just squatting, but actively rebuilding. And that changed everything. Victor sat in his office in Charleston, looking at the reports his local contacts had sent him, and he felt an unfamiliar sensation settling in his gut. Irritation, edging toward anger. He was not a man who tolerated obstacles, not a man who allowed complications to derail his plans, and this homeless teenager with his delusions of homesteading was not going to be the exception. Victor picked up his phone and dialed a number, and when the call connected, he gave instructions in a voice that was calm and pleasant, and utterly without warmth. "Find out everything about this boy," he said. "Find out who he is, where he came from, and what it will take to make him go away." The Crenshaw property was his, even if the boy didn't know it yet, and Victor Hale did not intend to let anyone, least of all a homeless child, stand in his way. The man arrived on a morning when the mist still clung to the hollows, stepping out of a black SUV that looked absurdly out of place on the rutted dirt track. Cole was on the roof when he heard the engine nailing down shingles, and he watched the vehicle approach with a wariness that tightened his grip on the hammer. No one came up here except Martha, and this was something expensive and aggressive, a vehicle that announced its driver as someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. The man who emerged was exactly what Cole expected, slick and polished, wearing clothes that probably cost more than everything Cole owned, with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. He introduced himself as Gerald Parsons, a representative of the Mountain Heritage Development Trust, and said he was here to discuss the property, to clear up what he called a misunderstanding. Cole climbed down and stood facing him, hammer still in hand, and listened as Parsons explained in a tone that was patient and condescending. The Crenshaw property, Parsons said, had been identified for acquisition by the trust, and while they appreciated Cole's enthusiasm for restoration, he was unfortunately occupying land earmarked for other purposes. But the trust was prepared to be generous, Parsons continued, producing an envelope. Inside was a check for $5,000, and all Cole had to do was pack up and walk away. Cole looked at the envelope, and for a treacherous moment he was tempted. $5,000 would change everything, would give him options, would let him start over somewhere else. But even as the temptation flickered, something harder rose up to meet it, and he found himself thinking about the weeks of labor he had poured into this place, the blisters and exhaustion and pride. He thought about Silas Crenshaw's journal, about the philosophy that some things were worth doing, not because they were easy, but because they were right. And he thought about the county clerk's office, where he had discovered that the property existed in legal limbo, and that someone occupying it openly and continuously could claim it through adverse possession. Cole looked up and met Parsons's eyes, and he said one word: "No." The smile flickered before reassembling into something harder. Parsons asked if Cole understood what he was turning down. if he understood the resources of the people he was dealing with. If he understood, this offer would not be repeated. Cole said he understood perfectly, and told Parsons about the adverse possession statute, about his intention to stay until the land was legally his. The smile disappeared entirely, replaced by something cold and flat, and Parsons tucked the envelope back into his jacket. He told Cole he was making a serious mistake, that there were other ways to handle situations like this, ways considerably less pleasant than a check. Then he walked back to his SUV without another word, and Cole watched him drive away. The threat hung in the air like smoke, but Cole felt no fear, only a grim determination that settled into his bones and made him feel more solid than he had ever felt before. The first attack came 3 days after Parsons's visit, and Cole discovered it when he returned from Martha's farm in the early evening, his pack heavy with food and his mind light with the satisfaction of honest work. He knew something was wrong before he even reached the clearing, a wrongness he felt in his gut before his eyes could identify it, and when he stepped out of the trees and saw what they had done, he stopped dead and felt something inside him go very still and very cold. His tools were everywhere, scattered across the clearing like a child's toys after a tantrum. The precious instruments he had salvaged and restored, hurled into the dirt and the underbrush with deliberate violence. His lumber pile, weeks of carefully selected and stacked timber seasoned and ready for use, had been toppled and thrown into the creek, the boards floating downstream or wedged between rocks, soaking up water that would warp and ruin them. The door he had built, the door he had hung with such pride on its salvaged hinges, had been kicked in, hanging now from a single twisted piece of metal. Cole walked through the destruction in a daze, picking up tools and examining them for damage, wading into the creek to retrieve what lumber he could, and with each act of recovery, he felt the coldness inside him, growing, hardening into something that was not quite anger, and not quite hate, but something more useful than either. Resolve. He knew who had done this, knew it as surely as he knew his own name, even though he had no proof, and never would. This was Victor Hale's answer to his refusal, the first move in a campaign designed to break his will and drive him off the land, and it was exactly what Cole should have expected from a man who sent slick representatives with checks and veiled threats. But if Hale thought that scattered tools and wet lumber would be enough to make Cole quit, he had badly miscalculated. Cole worked through the night, cleaning and organizing and assessing the damage, and by morning, the clearing looked almost normal again, the tools back in their places, the salvageable lumber stacked to dry, the door rehung on a new hinge he had fabricated from scrap metal. He was exhausted, his hands raw, and his back aching, but he felt something fierce burning in his chest that pushed back the fatigue, and he went back to work on the cabin as if nothing had happened. The second attack came a week later, and this one was more personal, more vicious. Cole woke before dawn to a smell that didn't belong, sharp and chemical, and when he went outside to investigate, he found his newly finished walls covered in crude graffiti, hateful words sprayed in dripping red paint that looked like blood in the grey morning light. The messages were simple and brutal. "Get out! You don't belong here! This is your last warning." Cole stood before the defaced walls, his walls, the walls he had built with his own hands, log by log, and he felt the coldness. Inside him, pulse and grow, felt it spreading through his veins like ice water, and he made a decision that would define everything that came after. He would not give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. He would not give them the pleasure of watching him run. He would clean this paint, repair this damage, and continue his work with even greater intensity. And every act of vandalism they committed would only strengthen his determination to stay. He spent the day scrubbing and sanding, removing every trace of their hatred from his walls, and when he was finished, the logs looked better than before, the sanding having brought out the grain of the wood in a way that was almost beautiful. He knew there would be more attacks, knew that Hale would not stop until he had exhausted every option, but Cole no longer cared. Let them come, he thought, as he stood in his clearing and looked at his cabin rising strong and defiant against the sky. Let them throw everything they have at me. I will still be here when they are done, and this place will still be mine, and nothing they do will ever change that. The harassment made one thing clear to Cole. He needed to solidify his claim to the land before Victor Hale found a way to take it from him through legal channels or any other means. He had been operating on instinct and desperation, squatting on abandoned property, and hoping that possession would somehow translate into ownership. But hope was not a strategy, and instinct would not protect him in a courtroom. He needed paperwork, needed documentation, needed to transform his presence on the mountain from trespass into something the law would recognize and defend. Martha had mentioned adverse possession during one of their conversations, had explained the basic concept in her practical, no-nonsense way, and Cole had done enough research at the small library in Ridgewood to understand that it was his best and perhaps only path to legitimate ownership. The law allowed someone who occupied land openly, continuously, and notoriously for a specified period to claim legal title, even without the original owner's permission, a doctrine designed to prevent productive land from lying fallow due to absent or unknown owners. The Crenshaw property seemed to fit the criteria perfectly. Abandoned for over 20 years, no known heirs, no taxes paid, no claim filed by anyone in all that time. If Cole could prove that he had been living there openly, that he had been improving the property, that he had been acting as if it were his own, he might be able to file a claim that would give him legal standing against whatever moves Hale tried to make. The county clerk's office was located in the basement of the Ridgewood courthouse, a cramped and airless room that smelled of old paper and mildew and the slow decay of bureaucracy. Cole pushed through the door and found himself in a space-lined floor-to-ceiling with filing cabinets and shelves of binders, a single fluorescent light buzzing overhead, and a desk at which sat a young woman with nervous eyes and mousy brown hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked up when he entered, and he saw the familiar flicker of assessment cross her face as she took in his appearance, the worn clothes and the calloused hands, and the look of someone who had been living rough. But she didn't dismiss him or treat him with contempt. Instead, she offered a tentative smile and asked how she could help. Cole explained what he wanted, and the young woman, whose name was Emily, listened carefully, her brow furrowing with concentration. She told him that adverse possession claims were rare and complicated, that they required extensive documentation and often took years to resolve, that they were frequently contested and even more frequently denied. But she also told him that the Crenshaw property was unusual, that it had been in legal limbo for so long that the county didn't quite know what to do with it, that Silas Crenshaw had no known heirs and had left no will and had simply vanished without a trace. She pulled out forms and binders and walked Cole through the requirements, explaining each section in careful detail, and Cole filled out the paperwork with the same intensity he brought to his work on the cabin, making sure every line was complete and every question was answered. He documented his arrival date, his improvements to the property, his continuous presence on the land. He described the repairs he had made to the cabin, the materials he had used, the hours he had invested. He attached photographs Martha had helped him take, showing the before and after of his restoration work, proving that he was not just occupying the land, but actively improving it. When he was finished, Emily reviewed the paperwork with meticulous care, checking each page, initialing each section, and finally stamping the whole package with an official seal that made Cole's heart beat faster. She told him that filing the claim was just the first step, that there would be a waiting period and a publication requirement, and possibly a hearing, that he should not expect a quick resolution. But she also told him, in a quiet voice that seemed almost conspiratorial, that his claim looked solid, that she had seen far weaker cases succeed, and that if he could hold on long enough, He might just have a chance. Cole thanked her and walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun, the copies of his filed paperwork clutched in his hand, and he felt something shift inside him, a sense that he was no longer just fighting against something, but fighting for something, that he had taken a step from survival toward legitimacy, from desperation toward hope. Martha had been watching Cole struggle with the quiet concern of someone who had seen too many good people ground down by forces larger than themselves, and she decided it was time to call in reinforcements. She told Cole one morning, as they worked side by side in her garden, that her nephew was coming to visit, a young lawyer who had grown up in Ridgewood, but had spent the last several years in the city building a practice, and she thought it might be useful for the two of them to talk. Cole was wary of the idea, had learned to distrust anyone with education and authority, but he trusted Martha more than he trusted his own instincts, and so he agreed to meet this nephew and hear what he had to say. Daniel Albright arrived at Martha's farmhouse on a Saturday afternoon, driving a sensible sedan that was neither flashy nor humble, and Cole studied him from the porch as he emerged and stretched after the long drive from Charleston. He was in his early 30s, with the same sharp blue eyes as his aunt, and a face that was handsome in a serious, thoughtful way, and he wore clothes that were casual but clearly expensive, the uniform of a professional on his day off. He greeted Martha with genuine warmth, lifting her off her feet in a hug that made her laugh and slap at his shoulders. And then he turned to Cole and extended his hand with a smile that was friendly but appraising. They sat on Martha's porch with glasses of sweet tea, and Daniel asked Cole to tell him everything from the beginning, leaving nothing out. Cole talked for nearly an hour, describing his arrival at the cabin, his work restoring it, his encounters with the people from the Development Trust, the harassment and vandalism, his filing of the adverse possession claim. Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression neutral, occasionally jotting notes in a small leather notebook, and Cole found himself unable to read what the lawyer was thinking, whether he was impressed or dismissive, whether he saw a case worth taking or a lost cause to be politely declined. When Cole finished, Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains with an expression that had shifted from neutral to something more complex, something that looked almost like anger. He told Cole that he knew Victor Hale, that everyone in the region knew Victor Hale, and that the man had been systematically buying up land for years, pressuring long-time residents to sell, using every trick in the book to assemble parcels for his resort development. He told Cole that his own aunt had received offers, increasingly aggressive offers, and that half the families who had been in these mountains for generations were being squeezed out by a man who saw their homes as nothing more than line items on a balance sheet. Daniel's voice was tight with a controlled fury that surprised Cole, and he realized that this was not just a legal matter for the young lawyer, but something personal, something that touched on questions of home and belonging, and the right of people to live on land that had been theirs for generations. Daniel turned to Cole and looked at him with those sharp blue eyes, and he said he would take the case. He warned Cole that it would not be easy, that Hale had powerful connections and deep pockets and a team of lawyers who would fight every step of the way. He warned him that adverse possession claims were notoriously difficult to win, that judges were often skeptical, that the burden of proof was high, and the process was slow. But he also said that Cole's claim had merit, that the documentation was solid, that the years of abandonment and the lack of heirs created a genuine legal opening. And he said something else, something that mattered more to Cole than any legal analysis. He said that what Cole was doing, rebuilding that cabin with his own hands, refusing to be driven out by money and intimidation, was exactly the kind of thing that deserved to be defended, and he was honored to be the one to defend it. Cole shook Daniel's hand, feeling for the first time that he was not alone in this fight, that he had allies who believed in what he was doing and were willing to stand beside him. Martha watched them from her chair with a small, satisfied smile, and Cole understood that this had been her plan all along, that she had seen what he needed before he knew it himself, and that her kindness continued to save him in ways he could never repay. The mountains gave their warning in the way the light changed, the afternoons growing shorter and the shadows longer, the air taking on a bite that cut through clothing and settled in the bones. Cole had lived through winters before, but always in heated houses with insulated walls, always with the safety net of civilization to catch him if things went wrong. This winter would be different, would be a test of everything he had built and everything he had learned, and if he failed it, if the cabin couldn't keep out the cold, or he couldn't keep himself fed, he would die alone on this mountain, and no one would find him until spring. The thought should have terrified him, and perhaps it did somewhere deep beneath the surface. But what he felt most acutely was not fear, but urgency, a desperate need to prepare, to finish, to make this place ready for what was coming. He worked longer hours than ever before, starting in the grey light of dawn, and continuing until darkness made it impossible to see. And the work took on a frantic quality that left him exhausted, but unable to stop. The wood stove was his first priority, because without heat, nothing else mattered. He had restored it over the course of several weeks, scrubbing away the rust, replacing the cracked fire bricks with stones he had shaped himself, fabricating a new length of stovepipe from sheet metal he had bought in town, with money earned from odd jobs at Martha's farm. Installing it was a delicate operation, cutting a hole in the roof for the pipe, sealing it against leaks, making sure the draft would draw properly and the cabin wouldn't fill with smoke. He lit the first fire on a cold October evening and sat before it for hours, watching the flames dance behind the iron door, feeling the heat radiate outward and push back the chill, and he felt a satisfaction so profound it brought tears to his eyes. Next came the chinking, the tedious but essential work of sealing every gap and crack in the walls against the wind and cold. He mixed batch after batch of clay and moss and packed it into the spaces between the logs, smoothing it with his fingers, building up layers until no light showed through and no draught could penetrate. He weatherproofed the door and the windows, installed a simple latch that could be barred from the inside, hung a heavy blanket over the doorway as an additional barrier against the cold. He cut firewood until his arms felt like they would fall off, felling dead trees and bucking them into rounds and splitting the rounds into pieces that would fit in the stove, stacking the wood in cords along the side of the cabin where the eaves would keep off the snow. He built a small smokehouse from scrap lumber and learned to preserve meat, a skill he picked up from Martha and from Silas Crenshaw's journal, which contained detailed instructions for smoking venison and fish. He hunted when he could, using snares and traps because he had no rifle, and what he caught he processed carefully, wasting nothing, storing everything against the lean months ahead. The days grew shorter and the nights grew colder, and Cole worked on, driven by a force that felt almost external, as if the mountain itself was pushing him to finish, to prove himself worthy of surviving in this place. And then one morning in late November, Cole woke to a changed world. The air had a different quality, a stillness and a smell that he recognized from some deep instinct, and when he opened the door, the first snowflakes were falling, drifting down from a sky the color of pewter, landing softly on the ground, and on the roof, and on his outstretched hand. He stepped onto the porch he had rebuilt, plank by plank, and he looked at his cabin, his home, solid and weather-tight, and ready for whatever the winter would bring. The roof he had framed and shingled was already dusting white, and smoke was rising from the chimney in a lazy curl, and the windows he had glazed were glowing with the light of the fire within. It was modest, far from perfect, full of imperfections that he saw every time he looked at it, but it was his, built by his own hands from nothing but ruins and determination. And as he stood there, watching the snow fall, Cole felt something he had not felt since before his mother got sick, something he had thought he might never feel again. Peace. It was fragile, he knew, threatened by Victor Hale and the legal battles to come, and the simple, brutal reality of winter in the mountains. But it was real, and it was his. And for this moment, at least, it was enough. The first blizzard came in early December, a howling white fury that descended on the mountain without warning, and buried the world beneath 3 feet of snow in a single night. Cole woke to a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight, the absolute absence of sound that only deep snow can create. And when he pushed open the door, he found himself staring at a wall of white that reached nearly to his chest. He spent hours digging out, carving a path to his woodpile and his smokehouse, and the small outhouse he had built behind the cabin. And by the time he finished, his muscles were screaming, and his lungs were burning from the cold air, and he understood with a new and visceral clarity what winter in the mountains truly meant. The temperature plunged in the days that followed, dropping so low that the trees cracked like gunshots in the night, and his breath froze in his beard before it left his face. He kept the wood stove burning around the clock, feeding it every few hours, waking in the darkness to add logs before the fire could die, and the cold could creep in. The cabin held, the chinking and weatherproofing doing their job, but still the cold found its way through, settling in the corners, turning the water in his bucket to ice, making every trip outside an ordeal that left him gasping and shaking. He rationed his food carefully, eating just enough to keep his strength up, and he melted snow for water, and he counted the days until the weather might break, and he could make his way down to Martha's farm for supplies. But the weather did not break, and the blizzards kept coming, one after another, each one adding to the snow until the drifts reached the eaves, and the world outside the cabin became an impassable wilderness of white. Cole was alone, truly alone, isolated in a way he had never experienced before, cut off from every other human being on Earth by miles of snow and cold that would kill him in hours if he tried to cross it. The solitude should have been unbearable, should have driven him mad with loneliness and fear. But instead, Cole found something unexpected in those long, dark weeks. He found focus. He turned to Silas Crenshaw's journal, reading it now not just for information, but for communion, for the sense of connection it gave him to another human mind, and he began to practice the techniques it described with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He worked on small pieces of scrap wood, the offcuts and broken boards that he had accumulated during his months of construction, and he practiced cuts and joints and finishes for hours each day, his hands growing more skilled with each repetition, his eye growing sharper, his understanding deepening. He made mistakes constantly, ruined piece after piece, but each failure taught him something, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, his work began to change. The joints grew tighter, the surfaces smoother, the proportions more pleasing. He began to see what Silas had written about, the way each piece of wood had its own character and wanted to become something specific, and he learned to read the grain and work with it instead of against it. By midwinter, he was creating pieces that were not just functional, but beautiful, small boxes and utensils and decorative objects that seemed to flow from the wood, as if they had always been there, waiting to be revealed. He made a bowl from a piece of cherry that glowed like amber in the firelight, its curves so smooth and its walls so thin that it seemed almost impossible. He made a picture frame from walnut with joints so precise that no glue was needed, the pieces holding together by geometry alone. He made a small chest with dovetails that fit like puzzle pieces, and a lid that closed with a satisfying whisper of wood against wood. Each piece was better than the last, and each one filled Cole with a wonder that he could not quite articulate, a sense that something was awakening inside him that had been sleeping his entire life. A talent he had never known he possessed, emerging from the crucible of solitude and snow. The snow began to melt in late March, the drifts shrinking day by day, the creek swelling with runoff until it roared past the cabin, in a torrent of brown water and tumbling ice. Cole emerged from his winter isolation like a bear from hibernation, blinking in the strengthening sun, his body lean and hard from months of rationed food and relentless work, his mind sharp and clear in a way it had never been before. He had survived, had made it through the brutal test of a mountain winter alone, and the knowledge of that accomplishment settled into him like bedrock, a foundation of confidence that nothing could shake. But survival was not enough, had never been enough, and as the world came back to life around him, Cole knew that he needed to take the next step, needed to find a way to turn his growing skill into something that could sustain him beyond mere subsistence. He had created dozens of pieces over the winter, boxes and bowls and frames and small items of furniture, and they sat in his cabin like a silent inventory, evidence of his transformation from desperate squatter to genuine craftsman. Martha saw them on her first visit after the thaw, climbing the muddy trail to check on him with a pack full of food and a heart full of worry. And when she stepped into the cabin and saw what he had made, she stopped in the doorway and stared with an expression Cole had never seen on her weathered face. Astonishment. She moved through the room slowly, picking up each piece, turning it in her hands, running her fingers over the surfaces and the joints. And when she looked at Cole, her sharp blue eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. She told him these were extraordinary, told him she had seen Silas Crenshaw's work in person decades ago, and that Cole's pieces had the same quality, the same sense of life and intention, and she told him he was wasting them by keeping them hidden in a cabin on a mountain where no one would ever see them. She knew someone, she said, a woman who owned an antique shop in a town about an hour away, a place that catered to tourists and collectors, and she thought Cole should bring his work there and see what happened. Cole resisted at first, the old wariness rising up, the fear of exposure and judgment that had kept him hidden for so long. But Martha insisted, and he trusted Martha, and so on a bright April morning, he loaded his pieces into her truck, and they drove together down the mountain and through the valley to a pretty little town called Hawthorne Springs. The antique shop was called Timeless Treasures, and its owner was a woman named Patricia, elegant and silver-haired, with reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and an eye for quality that had been honed over 30 years in the business. Martha made the introductions and then stepped back, letting Cole speak for himself, and he presented his work with a nervousness that made his hands tremble slightly as he unwrapped each piece from the cloth he had used to protect them. Patricia examined the pieces in silence, her face unreadable, and with each passing second, Cole felt his anxiety growing, felt certain that she was going to tell him they were amateur work, that he had been fooling himself, that his winter of practice had produced nothing of value. But when she finally looked up at him, her expression was not dismissive, but wondering, and she asked him where he had learned to work like this, asked if he knew whose style he was echoing, asked if he understood what he had created. She told him these pieces were remarkable, told him they showed a mastery of technique that most craftsmen never achieved in a lifetime, told him she would be honored to sell them in her shop. She offered him prices that seemed impossibly high, more money than Cole had ever held in his hands, and she displayed the pieces in her front window, with small cards that described them as the work of a young master craftsman, working in the tradition of the legendary Silas Crenshaw. They sold within a week, every single one, snapped up by tourists and collectors who recognized quality when they saw it, and Patricia called Cole to tell him she needed more, as many as he could make, as fast as he could make them. Cole took the money and felt something shift inside him, a door opening onto a future he had never imagined, and he reinvested every penny into his work, buying quality hardwoods and better tools and materials that would let him create pieces even more beautiful than the ones that had sold. He was not just surviving anymore, he was building something, and for the first time in his life, he could see the shape of what it might become. The pieces sold faster than Cole could make them, each one disappearing from Patricia's shop within days of being displayed, and the customers who bought them wanted to know more, wanted the story behind the work, wanted to understand who had created these beautiful objects that seemed to carry something of the forest and the mountain in their grain. Patricia told them what she knew, the tale of a young man living alone in the ruins of the legendary Silas Crenshaw's cabin, teaching himself the old master's techniques from a journal he had discovered, rebuilding both the structure and his own life with nothing but determination and an extraordinary natural talent. The story was irresistible, a narrative of redemption and craft, and solitary struggle that captured something deep in the American imagination. And it spread from customer to customer, from Hawthorne Springs to the surrounding towns, until it reached the ears of someone who recognized its potential. Her name was Sarah Chen, and she was a journalist for Appalachian Life, a glossy regional magazine that covered the culture and characters of the mountain South. She drove up to the cabin on a warm May afternoon, navigating the rutted track in a rental car that scraped its undercarriage on every rock, and Cole watched her approach from his workshop with a wariness that bordered on hostility. He had avoided attention his entire life, had learned to associate visibility with danger, and the thought of a journalist poking into his history and his circumstances made his stomach clench with anxiety. But Sarah was patient and respectful, explaining that she wanted to tell his story on his terms, that she would show him the article before it was published, and remove anything he objected to. And something in her manner, earnest and curious without being pushy, made Cole decide to trust her. They talked for hours, sitting on the porch he had rebuilt, and Cole told her a version of his story that was honest without being complete, describing his arrival at the cabin and his discovery of Silas's journal and his months of struggle and learning, but leaving out the details of his mother's death and his flight from foster care that still felt too raw and too private to share. Sarah listened with the focused attention of a professional, asking questions that drew out details Cole hadn't realized were interesting, and she took photographs of everything, the cabin and the workshop and the furniture, and Cole himself, capturing images that showed the reality of his life without exploiting or sensationalizing it. The article appeared 6 weeks later, and it was everything Sarah had promised, a beautifully written piece that painted Cole as a young craftsman of extraordinary talent who had found purpose and redemption in the ancient art of woodworking. The photographs were stunning, showing the cabin golden in the afternoon light, and the furniture glowing with the depth and warmth of carefully finished wood, and the headline across the top of the page read, "The Heir of Crenshaw Hollow," in elegant serif type. Cole read it sitting on his porch, and he felt strange seeing his life translated into words and images, felt exposed in a way that was uncomfortable, but also, he had to admit, somewhat thrilling. What he did not anticipate, could not have anticipated, was what happened next. The magazine posted the article on its website, and someone shared it on social media, and then someone else shared it, and within a week, The Heir of Crenshaw Hollow had been viewed by hundreds of thousands of people around the world. Comments poured in from readers who were moved by the story, who wanted to know more about Cole and his work, who wanted to buy his furniture and support his journey. Patricia's phone rang constantly with inquiries from collectors and designers and gallery owners, and she called Cole in a state of near hysteria, telling him that she had orders for more pieces than he could make in a year, that people were offering prices that made his previous sales look like pocket change, that his life was about to change in ways he could not imagine. Cole stood in his clearing with the phone pressed to his ear, listening to Patricia's breathless recitation of numbers and names, and he felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, felt the quiet, solitary life he had built beginning to crack under the pressure of a world that suddenly wanted a piece of him. The attention that had seemed like such a blessing revealed its darker edge within weeks of the article's publication, and the first sign of trouble came in the form of a thick envelope delivered to Martha's farm, where Cole still received his mail. Daniel Albright called him that same evening, his voice tight with controlled anger, and told Cole to come down the mountain immediately because they needed to talk. Cole made the trip the next morning, his stomach churning with anxiety the entire way, and he found Daniel waiting for him at Martha's kitchen table with the envelope's contents spread before him, a stack of legal documents dense with terminology and citations that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Daniel explained it in terms Cole could understand, his jaw clenched and his blue eyes hard with fury. Victor Hale had filed a legal challenge to Cole's adverse possession claim, asserting that the Crenshaw property actually belonged to a subsidiary of his development company through a deed dating back to 1952, a deed that had supposedly been lost in a courthouse fire but had recently been discovered in the records of a defunct title company. According to Hale's lawyers, Silas Crenshaw had never owned the land at all, but had merely been a tenant, and his disappearance had not created an abandoned property, but simply a vacancy on land that had always belonged to someone else. The claim was audacious, breathtaking in its shamelessness, and Daniel told Cole that it was almost certainly fraudulent, that the deed was in all likelihood a forgery created specifically to defeat Cole's claim and clear the way for Hale's resort development, but almost certainly was not the same as definitely, and likely was not the same as proven, and Daniel explained with grim clarity what they were facing. To defeat Hale's challenge, they would need to prove that the deed was a forgery, and that would require expert analysis of the document, research into historical records, depositions and testimony from witnesses who might or might not be willing to come forward. It would require time, months at minimum, and possibly years, and it would require money, tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees and expert costs that Cole did not have, and could not earn quickly enough, no matter how many pieces of furniture he sold. Hale knew all of this, Daniel said, knew it perfectly well, and that was precisely his strategy. He was betting that Cole could not afford to fight, that the weight of a protracted legal battle would crush him, that eventually he would give up and walk away, rather than face financial ruin, defending a claim he might lose anyway. It was a classic tactic of the wealthy and the powerful, using the legal system not to seek justice, but to exhaust and destroy anyone who stood in their way. And Daniel had seen it work too many times to count. Cole sat at Martha's table and felt the familiar, cold fury building in his chest, the same fury he had felt when he found his tools scattered and his walls defaced. But this time it was mixed with something else, a weariness that frightened him more than the anger. He had fought so hard and come so far, had rebuilt himself along with the cabin, had begun to believe that he might actually have a future on that mountain. And now Victor Hale was trying to take it all away, with a piece of paper and a team of lawyers and a bank account deep enough to outlast any resistance. Daniel must have seen something in his face, because he leaned forward and gripped Cole's shoulder with a fierceness that surprised him. He told Cole that they were going to fight this, that he would work the case himself and defer his fees until they won, that he had contacts who might help with the expert costs, that Hale had made a mistake by being so blatant in his fraud, because blatant fraud was easier to prove than subtle fraud. He told Cole that the magazine article had changed things, that public sentiment was now on his side, that Hale could no longer operate in the shadows without people noticing and asking questions. He told Cole not to give up, not to let Hale win by default, not to surrender everything he had built without a fight. Cole looked at Daniel and then at Martha, who had been sitting quietly in the corner with an expression of fierce determination on her weathered face, and he felt something in his chest loosen slightly, felt the weariness recede just enough of the anger to burn through clean and hot. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion, and he told Daniel to do whatever needed to be done, to fight with everything they had, because he was not going anywhere, and Victor Hale could go to hell. Daniel had told him to search the cabin for anything that might support his claim, any documents or records that Silas Crenshaw might have left behind that could prove ownership or counter the dubious deed that Hale's lawyers had produced, and Cole had spent days going through every corner and crevice of the structure he thought he knew so well. He had found nothing of use, only the journal he already possessed, and a few scraps of paper too faded and damaged to read, and he was beginning to despair when he remembered the one place he had never properly explored: the root cellar. It was a small space dug into the earth beneath the cabin, accessible through a heavy trapdoor in the floor that Cole had opened once when he first arrived, and then dismissed as nothing but a hole in the ground, dark and damp and empty except for a few rotted wooden shelves and the smell of mold. But Daniel had told him to be thorough, to check everywhere, and so on a grey afternoon with rain pattering on the roof, Cole lifted the trapdoor and descended the rickety ladder into the darkness below. He had brought a lantern this time, and its light revealed the cellar in greater detail than his initial glance had provided. The earthen walls shored up with old timbers, the floor packed hard and dry despite the dampness in the air, the shelves bare except for a few broken jars, and the desiccated remains of vegetables canned decades ago. It seemed as empty and useless as he remembered, and he was about to climb back up when he noticed something that stopped him cold, a section of the wall that didn't match the rest. The timbers there were the same age and the same wood, but they were fitted together differently, more precisely, with a kind of tight joinery that he had come to recognize as Silas Crenshaw's signature. Cole moved closer, holding the lantern up, and he saw that what he had taken for a solid wall was actually a door, a hidden panel so perfectly constructed that it was virtually invisible unless you knew what to look for. His heart began to pound as he searched for a way to open it, running his fingers along the edges, pressing and pulling at the timbers, and finally he found it. A small wooden peg that looked like a knot, but wasn't. And when he pushed it, something clicked, and the panel swung inward on silent hinges. The space beyond was small, perhaps 8 feet square, and it was not empty. Cole stepped through the opening and raised his lantern, and what he saw made him gasp aloud, his breath catching in his throat as if he had been punched. Furniture filled the room, a dozen pieces arranged with care on wooden platforms that kept them off the floor, and even in the dim light of the lantern, Cole could see that these were not ordinary pieces, not even extraordinary pieces like the ones he had been making, but something beyond anything he had ever seen or imagined. There was a writing desk with legs that seemed to flow like water, a chair whose curves were so perfect they looked organic rather than made, a cabinet with doors inlaid in patterns of such complexity that his eyes couldn't quite follow them. The craftsmanship was superhuman, impossible, the work of a master who had spent decades refining his skills to a level that Cole could barely comprehend, and he understood instantly why Silas had hidden them here. These were his greatest works, his legacy, too precious to sell and too important to leave exposed to the world. Cole moved through the room in a daze, touching each piece with reverent fingers, feeling the surfaces that were smoother than glass and the joints that were tighter than anything he had achieved. And in the corner, resting on its own platform, he found something else, a metal box, fireproof and waterproof, sealed with a latch that opened with a click when he pressed it. Inside were documents, a stack of papers protected by the box from the moisture and decay that would have destroyed them otherwise, and Cole carried them back up the ladder and into the light of the cabin to read them. The first was a deed, an original deed to the Crenshaw property, dated 1958, signed and notarized, proving beyond any doubt that Silas had purchased the land legally and outright. The second was a will, handwritten but properly witnessed, leaving the property and all its contents to whoever shall restore this cabin and continue my work in the spirit of true craftsmanship. The third was a letter, several pages long, written in Silas's precise hand, and as Cole read it, the mystery that had hung over the cabin for 20 years finally resolved itself into a truth that was stranger and sadder and more valuable than anything he could have imagined. The letter explained everything, unraveling the mystery of Silas Crenshaw's disappearance in a narrative that was both tragic and strangely hopeful. Silas wrote that he had discovered something remarkable on his property in the early 1970s, a hidden grove deep in a ravine on the far edge of his land, where a species of hardwood grew that had been thought extinct in the Appalachians for over a century. The wood was extraordinary, with a grain so fine and a colour so rich that it seemed to glow from within. And it worked under his tools, like nothing he had ever encountered, responding to his hands as if it wanted to become the shapes he imagined. He had used it sparingly, only for his greatest pieces, the masterworks he kept hidden in the cellar, and he had told no one of its existence, because he knew what would happen if the world learned of it. They would come for it, the developers, and the loggers, and the men who saw trees only as lumber, and lumber only as money. And they would strip the grove bare, and leave nothing but stumps and silence. So he had kept his secret, and he had lived alone with it, and he had grown old wondering what would happen to it when he was gone. The letter described his growing despair as his health began to fail, his fear that everything he had built and protected would be destroyed after his death by people who understood nothing of craft or beauty, or the slow, patient work of creating something that would outlast its maker. He had no family, no heirs, no one he trusted to continue his work, and he had begun to believe that his only choice was to let the cabin decay and hope that the forest would reclaim the grove before anyone discovered it. But then, the letter said, he had conceived of another plan, a desperate gamble that might preserve his legacy if fate was kind. He would disappear, would walk away from his life and his property, and let the world believe he was dead, and he would leave behind a will that would pass everything not to a named individual, but to whoever proved themselves worthy by restoring the cabin and continuing his craft. It was a test, he wrote, a way of ensuring that his legacy would go only to someone who understood its value, someone who would protect the grove and honor the work rather than exploit it for profit. He did not know if such a person would ever come, did not know if his gamble would succeed, or if the cabin would simply rot and the secret would die with it, but it was the only hope he had, and so he had taken it. The letter ended with a description of where he had gone, a small town in Canada where he had lived out his remaining years under another name, and a final message to whoever was reading his words. If you have found this, then you have passed my test. The cabin is yours. The grove is yours. The work is yours. Protect them. Honor them. Create something beautiful. Cole read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling, his mind reeling with the implications of what he held. He was not a squatter, not a trespasser, not a homeless kid playing house in someone else's ruin. He was Silas Crenshaw's chosen heir, selected by a test he hadn't known he was taking, validated by a will that gave him not just the right to be here, but the responsibility to continue a legacy. The deed in the box proved that Silas had owned the land legally, which meant that Hale's fraudulent document was exactly what Daniel had suspected, a forgery designed to steal what it could not legitimately claim. And the will, properly witnessed and dated before Silas's disappearance, changed everything about Cole's legal position, transforming him from a claimant under adverse possession to a direct beneficiary under a valid testamentary instrument. He brought the documents to Daniel that same day, driving down the mountain in Martha's truck, with the metal box clutched in his lap like a holy relic, and he watched Daniel's face as the lawyer read through the papers, watched the skepticism turn to surprise, and then to a fierce, triumphant joy. Daniel told him this was it. This was exactly what they needed. This was a game-changer that would blow Hale's case out of the water and establish Cole's claim beyond any possible challenge. He filed the will with the court the next morning, along with a motion to dismiss Hale's challenge in light of the newly discovered evidence, and he told Cole that while the legal process would still take time, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Cole, Brennan was the rightful owner of the Crenshaw property, not by occupation or default, but by the explicit bequest of the man who had built it, and no amount of money or lawyers or forged documents could take that away from him. Cole had learned long ago that desperate men do desperate things, and Victor Hale was nothing if not desperate now, his carefully constructed scheme collapsing around him, like a house built on sand. The filing of Silas Crenshaw's will had changed everything, had transformed Cole from a vulnerable squatter into a legally protected heir, and Hale's forged deed was exposed for exactly what it was, a clumsy fraud that would likely result in criminal charges once the court finished examining it. A smarter man might have cut his losses and walked away, might have accepted that this particular battle was lost, and moved on to other conquests. But Hale was not smart in the way that mattered most, was not wise enough to know when he was beaten, and Cole had seen enough of his tactics to know that he would not go quietly. So Cole prepared, and he waited, and when the attack came, he was ready for it. He had moved the original documents to Daniel's office the day after they were filed with the court, keeping only copies at the cabin, and he had told no one of the hidden room in the cellar or the masterworks it contained, had sealed the entrance again so perfectly that no one would find it unless they knew exactly where to look. He had installed warning systems around the property, simple but effective, tripwires connected to cans filled with pebbles that would rattle and clang if anyone crossed them, and he had mapped every approach to the cabin in his mind, knew every tree and rock and shadow, knew where to hide and where to watch, and where to strike if striking became necessary. He slept lightly in those days, one ear always listening for sounds that didn't belong, and on a moonless night in late June, he heard them. The rattle of pebbles came first, distant but unmistakable. And Cole was on his feet and out the back window before the sound had faded, moving through the darkness with the silent, sure-footedness of someone who had spent months navigating this terrain in all conditions. He circled around to the north, keeping to the trees, and he saw them approaching from the trail, 3 men moving with the clumsy confidence of city people who thought darkness was the same as concealment, carrying flashlights that marked their positions like beacons. Cole recognized none of them, but he knew who had sent them, knew what they had come for, and he felt the cold fury rising in his chest as he watched them approach his home with the intention of violating it. He let them get close, let them reach the edge of the clearing, where they paused and conferred in whispers that carried clearly in the still night air, and then he announced his presence in a voice that came from everywhere and nowhere, a voice that told them they were trespassing on private property and had exactly 30 seconds to leave before he called the sheriff. The men spun around, their flashlights sweeping wildly, but Cole was not where his voice had been, had already moved to a new position, and he spoke again from a different direction, telling them that he knew who had sent them, and that their employer was already facing criminal charges, and that anyone caught on this property tonight would be joining him in court. The men were rattled now, their confidence evaporating, as they realized they were facing someone who knew the terrain and held the advantage, someone who could see them while they could not see him. And Cole pressed harder, throwing a stone that crashed through the underbrush behind them and sent them spinning toward the new threat that wasn't there. He told them about the sheriff's deputy, who lived just down the mountain, about the security cameras he had installed that were recording everything, about the neighbors who had promised to respond to any signal of distress, and though some of it was bluff, and some of it was exaggeration, enough of it was true that the men had no way of knowing where the lies ended and the reality began. The confrontation lasted less than 5 minutes, and it ended without violence, without Cole even showing himself, ended with the 3 men retreating back down the trail, at a pace just short of a run, their flashlights bobbing in the darkness as they fled from a 17-year-old kid who had outmaneuvered them completely. Cole watched them go, his heart pounding, his hands steady, and he felt something settle into place inside him, a knowledge that he had faced down the worst that Victor Hale could throw at him and had not broken, had not run, had stood his ground and defended his home, and won. He returned to the cabin as the first grey light of dawn began to touch the sky, and he sat on his porch and watched the sun rise over the mountains, and he knew that whatever came next, he was ready for it. The courtroom in the Ridgewood County Courthouse was small and old, with wooden benches worn smooth by decades of anxious waiting and tall windows that let in slanting afternoon light. And on the day of the hearing, every seat was filled and people stood along the walls and crowded in the doorway, craning their necks to see. Cole sat at the plaintiff's table beside Daniel, wearing clothes that Martha had helped him pick out, clean and pressed and more formal than anything he had worn since his mother's funeral, and he kept his hands flat on the table to stop them from trembling. Across the aisle sat Victor Hale and his team of lawyers, expensive suits and polished shoes, and faces set in expressions of confident disdain. But Cole had learned to read people during his months of solitude and struggle, and he could see the cracks beneath the surface, the tension in Hale's jaw, and the way his eyes kept darting toward the door, as if calculating his escape. The judge was a woman, in her 60s, named Eleanor Marsh, known throughout the county for her fairness and her impatience with nonsense, and she had reviewed the evidence thoroughly before the hearing, had studied the authenticated will and the original deed, and the expert analysis, proving that Hale's document was a forgery created within the last 5 years, using artificially aged paper and ink. She had read the depositions detailing the harassment campaign, the scattered tools, and the vandalism, and the midnight visit from Hale's men, and she had seen the photographs of the cabin that Cole had rebuilt from ruins. The before and after that told the story of his months of labor more eloquently than any words. The hearing itself was almost anticlimactic, the outcome so clear from the evidence that Hale's lawyers barely mounted a defense, offering only weak procedural objections that Judge Marsh dismissed with undisguised irritation. Daniel presented the case methodically, walking through each piece of evidence, each document, each witness, building an edifice of fact so solid that no argument could shake it. And when he finished, he sat down beside Cole and gave him a small nod that said everything was going to be all right. Judge Marsh took less than an hour to render her decision, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and firm and carried to every corner of the packed courtroom. She ruled that Silas Crenshaw's will was valid and enforceable, that Cole Brennan had satisfied its conditions by restoring the cabin and continuing Crenshaw's craft in good faith, and that the property therefore belonged to him by legal right of inheritance. She ruled that Victor Hale's deed was a forgery, and that his legal challenge was not merely without merit, but was part of a pattern of fraud and intimidation that warranted referral to the district attorney for criminal investigation. She ruled that Cole was entitled to costs and damages, that Hale was to have no further contact with him or his property, and that any future harassment would be met with the full force of the law. And then she looked directly at Cole, her stern face softening just slightly, and she told him that what he had accomplished was remarkable, that he had taken a ruin and made it into a home, and had refused to be driven out by men who thought their money and their power made them above the law, and that she was proud to rule in his favor. The courtroom erupted, not with the polite murmur of approval, but with cheers and applause that startled Cole with their intensity, and he turned and saw faces he recognized, people from Ridgewood who had once looked at him with suspicion and hostility, now on their feet and clapping and smiling at him with something that looked like pride. Harold Tatum from the hardware store was there, and Emily from the clerk's office, and a dozen others whose names he didn't know, but whose faces he had seen around town, and they were cheering for him, celebrating his victory as if it were their own. Martha was crying openly, her weathered face streaming with tears, and Daniel was shaking his hand and clapping him on the back. And somewhere in the chaos, Cole saw Victor Hale and his lawyers gathering their things and slipping out the side door, defeated and diminished, their empire of greed and corruption crumbling around them. Cole stood in the middle of it all, the noise and the joy and the overwhelming relief, and he felt something break open in his chest, something that had been locked tight since the day his mother died, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he let himself believe that he was going to be okay, that he had a place in the world, that he had won. The story spread like wildfire in the days after the verdict. picked up by news outlets far beyond the regional magazine that had first discovered Cole, carried across the country and around the world by the irresistible combination of justice served and dreams fulfilled. Journalists called Daniel's office asking for interviews, and television producers sent emails proposing documentaries, and collectors who had never heard of Cole Brennan before suddenly wanted his furniture, with a desperation that bordered on obsession. Patricia's shop was overwhelmed with orders, her phone ringing constantly, her email flooded with inquiries from galleries and museums, and wealthy individuals willing to pay almost anything for a piece made by the young craftsman who had defeated a corrupt developer and inherited a legendary master's legacy. The prices for Cole's work climbed to levels that made his head spin. Thousands of dollars for a single chair, tens of thousands for a cabinet, and the money flowed into his bank account faster than he could comprehend, transforming him from a homeless teenager counting coins for rice into someone who would never have to worry about survival again. But Cole had not rebuilt his life from ruins in order to become rich, had not fought off Victor Hale, and survived a mountain winter alone just to accumulate wealth. And as the money piled up, he found himself thinking, not about what he could buy, but about what he could build. Not about his own comfort, but about the kids who were out there right now going through what he had gone through, alone and afraid, and convinced that no one cared whether they lived or died. He knew those kids, had been one of them, and he knew that what had saved him was not luck or charity, but the discovery that he could create something with his own hands, that he had value and capability that no one could take away. He wanted to give that discovery to others, wanted to create a place where young people from difficult backgrounds could learn the skills and discipline that had transformed his life. And so he took the money that was pouring in, and he used it not for himself, but for them. He built a workshop school at the cabin, a beautiful timber frame structure that rose beside Silas Crenshaw's original workshop, with benches for 12 students and tools of the highest quality, and wood stacked in racks ready to be shaped into something meaningful. He partnered with social services and youth organizations to identify candidates, kids aging out of foster care, or escaping bad situations, or simply lost and looking for direction. And he offered them free room and board and training, asking nothing in return except their effort and their commitment to the craft. Martha helped him run it, her practical wisdom and sharp tongue perfect for keeping the students in line, and Daniel handled the legal and financial complexities, setting up a non-profit foundation that would ensure the school's survival long after Cole was gone. The first class of students arrived in the fall, 6 young people with wary eyes and defensive postures, and chips on their shoulders the size of boulders, and Cole recognized every one of them, because he had been every one of them, and he welcomed them to the cabin that had saved his life, and told them it was going to save theirs, too. He taught them the way he had learned, through doing and failing, and doing again, through the slow, patient work of shaping wood and discovering what it wanted to become. And he watched them transform as the way he had transformed, watched the wariness fade, and the confidence grow, and the understanding dawn. They were capable of more than they had ever imagined. The cabin that had once been a forgotten ruin, abandoned and decaying in the wilderness, became a place of hope, a monument to what determination and integrity could build. And Cole stood on its porch in the evenings, and looked at the lights glowing in the workshop windows, and listened to the sounds of saws and chisels, and young voices laughing, and he felt a satisfaction deeper than anything wealth could provide. He had taken the worst thing that had ever happened to him, and turned it into the best thing he could give to others. And that, he understood now, was what Silas Crenshaw had wanted all along. Not just someone to inherit his property, but someone to continue his work in the truest and most important sense. Someone who would use the gift not for profit, but for purpose. Not for taking, but for giving. The autumn sun hung low over the valley, painting the mountains in shades of gold and amber and deep crimson, and Cole stood on the porch of his cabin and watched the light move across the landscape like a slow and silent blessing. A year had passed since the court ruling, a year of building and teaching and becoming something he had never imagined he could be, and the cabin that rose behind him was no longer the desperate project of a homeless teenager, but a finished work of art, a seamless blend of Silas Crenshaw's original vision and Cole's own creativity that drew visitors from around the world just to stand in the clearing and admire it. The logs were tight and true, chinked with care and weathered to a rich honey brown, and the roof he had rebuilt plank by plank, swept upward in clean, strong lines that seemed to grow from the mountain itself. Inside, the sounds of the workshop drifted through the open windows, the rhythmic rasp of saws, and the tap of chisels, and the voices of students calling to each other as they worked, a music that filled Cole with a satisfaction so profound it felt like prayer. There were 8 of them now, young people from backgrounds as broken as his own, learning not just to make furniture, but to make themselves, discovering through the patient work of their hands that they had value and capability and a future worth building. Martha sat in a rocking chair on the porch beside him, a chair Cole had made for her as a gift, its curves so smooth and its joints so perfect that she had cried when he presented it to her. She was smiling now, her weathered face soft with contentment, and he knew that without her kindness on that desperate day when he had stumbled onto her property, none of this would exist. He thought of his mother then, as he often did at moments like this, and he wished she could see what he had become, wished she could stand beside him on this porch and look at what he had built. He knew she would be proud. He had arrived on this mountain with nothing, a broke and homeless boy with no future, fleeing a world that didn't care whether he lived or died. He had found a ruin, and had seen in it not decay, but possibility, had faced down harassment and intimidation, and a brutal winter alone, and he had won. He had discovered a talent he never knew he possessed, and a purpose that gave his life meaning. Standing there with Martha beside him and the sounds of young people learning to create something beautiful floating on the air, Cole understood that he was leaving behind the boy he had been, and stepping fully into the man he had become, a man who had built his life from the ground up, leaving the town and the world speechless.